Okay, I get it. You're angry at me because I said your ancient sci-fi civilization with airships and star forts doesn't actually exist. Sorry, where are my manners? If you're new, you probably want a bit of context on what's going on here. In my Debunking Tartaria series, I proved that the Tartarian Empire is a complete misrepresentation and a blatant lie that has been peddled to you by social media grifters who financially benefit from this misrepresentation of history. These Tartarian theories are based off of the writings of Russian nationalists from the 1970s, but the current conspiracy has completely reinterpreted what these original authors meant, and it now represents something entirely different. And as you can see, the evidence I brought forward to prove this has upset a few people. Despite these comments though, I do stand by my original point, and I'm going to continue with the series anyway. In my first video debunking Tartaria, I addressed the claims by Russian nationalist historian Anatoly Fomenko. Fomenko claimed that Tartaria was the historic name for Russia, and that Russia in fact had historic rights to all of the territories that belonged to Tartaria. I'm sure it's also just a massive coincidence that these places he was trying to claim as Russian were places the USSR tried to annex on multiple occasions. I also explained why the term Tartaria became so popular in Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And no, it's not because the Tartarian Empire was a real place. I also pointed out a lot of inconsistencies in the Tartarian Empire's timeline, and I demonstrated how Tartarian grifters have stolen ideas from popular works of fiction from the 20th century and applied it to the Tartarian theory to make it more interesting. Then in part 2 I addressed the mud flood, mainly saying how it would be impossible under the conditions offered by Tartarian theorists, and also used geological evidence to prove that it never happened. This included a case study on street level raising to explain the existence of subterranean architecture, and also had a pretty detailed look at the presence of basalt flows all over the world to prove that the mud flood did not happen. Most of the comments you are going to see today are taken from these two videos. I won't spend much longer talking about the videos themselves, but if you are interested in watching them, I will put the links in the description. I've also made a few shorts videos about Tartaria. I probably won't link them into this video, but if you are interested in watching them, then they are available on my channel. So that's enough about the past. Let's look at today's video. I wasn't actually going to make a comment response video for a few more months yet. I was probably going to do it after part 4. But I've already had enough hateful and misinformed comments after just 2 videos to make this one today, so here we are. I've already touched on this, but a lot of the comments we're going to be looking at in this video today are a bit condescending, a bit rude, wildly misinformed as well. So it could get a bit heated. So to ensure cooler heads prevail, I'm going to wear this funny hat for the rest of the video, and hopefully that will take the edge off. So let's see what comment we've got first. This is from part 1 of my Debunking Tartaria series. I can't find the actual comment on the video anymore, so it's a good job I screenshot it first before he may have deleted it. Why not lead with some of the most compelling physical evidence? You're starting the series of pre-made, the standard narrative, conclusions, or pretending to be some objective man of reason. You're a hypocrite. I didn't lead with the physical arguments because this relates to the mud flood and the architecture, which were the main subjects of episode 2 and also episode 3, which is coming soon. You would know this if you made it more than 8 minutes into the video you actually commented on and saw the rundown of episodes that are going to feature in the series. I actually went into quite a lot of detail on the mud flood for episode 2, and episode 3 is standing to be the longest episode of the entire series, so I would recommend you stick around for that if you want to know more. And calling historical facts that are measurable and provable pre-made conclusions is a little bit misleading and a very interesting choice of words. Like, would you have preferred it if I made everything up instead of referring to these pre-made conclusions? And let's also not pretend that you aren't hanging on the words of the pre-made conclusions from the Tartarian theorists you've been lapping up on TikTok and Facebook. And the selective language choice in this comment is almost on BBC News level of bias. What you agree with is described as evidence, and what you disagree with is described as a pre-made conclusion. Interesting. So you're making such choice language, yet I'm the one who's pretending to be objective and is a hypocrite. Okay. Our next comment simply says, I found a plant. Buddy, if I were a plant, I would have a much better setup than this. Does this look like the setup of a plant to you? Or someone who makes money from YouTube? I'm using a suitcase as a tripod, for Christ's sake. Next one. Okay, this guy left quite a few comments on my videos, which is great for me because it's given me the chance to make this video. So let's have a look at a few of them now. So, this is tagged at 8 minutes and 5 seconds. So I'll play that clip now so you know what he's talking about. Author Janine Helene claims that the mud flood happened in 1834. Then the website Stolen History claims it happens in 1840. And then author James W. Lee, who I'll be talking about a lot in the coming episodes, claims that the mud flood happened at least locally in 1862. So who do you believe? In response to that, he says, "Isn't it a bit much to want the theory of one of these people to be totally correct and the final and definitive answer?" No, I don't think so. You know, for a group of people that love to poke holes in mainstream history, they sure have a lot of excuses ready when you hold their beliefs to the same standard. If you're going to deny such provable, objective and concrete historical evidence, then you're going to need a pretty decent alternative to back it up. And the fact of the matter is, the Tartarian theory just doesn't. Anyway, back to the comment. I think you should evaluate the evidence shown and then from there look further. You mean like how I did a case study of James W. Lee's book about Tartaria in the very video that you're commenting on? Evidence like that, perhaps? Is there something wrong with what we learned? Yes, there is. I have commented on this a lot in the past, but I will go over it again now. There are a lot of historical figures that are sugar-coated by our history books. There are a lot of historical events that are completely glazed over to protect our idea of nationalism and patriotism. This is particularly common in the United Kingdom. When we learn about the British Empire in school, we always learn about the good things the British Empire did, like World War I and infrastructure, but it's very rarely mentioned of all the bad things the British Empire did, such as the Bengali famine, for example, or the concentration camps in Kenya during World War II. These things just aren't mentioned in our history books, and this is the problem with historical narratives, and this is why people don't trust history. It's because our leaders are trying to weaponize history to make us believe a certain way. That does not mean, however, that absolutely everything you have ever been taught about history is a complete lie. There's also a big problem in history with clear facts being misrepresented as an opinion. This is done to undermine historical evidence by oppositions of those historical facts. A good example of that is Tartarian theorists taking true historical facts and referring to it as a pre-made conclusion. You've shown pictures of whole buried stories of houses. Can you explain those of the history we are told and shown? If not, make a better theory for them. The pictures you're referring to in the video I did actually explain quite explicitly. So either you missed that bit because you were angry typing in the comments, or you just chose to ignore it. I also mentioned Prague, I mentioned Paris, I mentioned London, I mentioned Canterbury. Canterbury was actually my main case study. So I'm not quite sure which picture in the video he's saying I didn't provide any context for, because all of them were covered pretty extensively as far as I'm concerned. Denying evidence should not be the way, even if the explanation given for it does not sit right with you and may need improvement or reinterpretation. Holy projection. Like, how can a Tartarian theorist sit there and write this with a straight face, not realising the absolute hypocrisy of their words? Like, you are the one who is denying clear historical evidence because it does not sit right with your personal beliefs on the Tartarian Empire. So who's really the one that needs to reinterpret information that's available to them? Like, if your opinion does not align with the facts, then the facts are not the problem. Okay, next comment. We're going back to episode 1 for this one. I hate when people confuse education with intelligence. You can have a bachelor's degree and still be an idiot. I'm sorry, but you don't show any proof, you only repeat mainstream history. The only proof I set are that the indoctrination of his story are working and you think you have all the right answer. First of all, I have a master's degree and a bachelor's degree. If you're going to insult me, at least be accurate about it. And you don't show any proof, you only share mainstream history. History is proof. Like, Jesus Christ. I am zen. I am calm. This comment feels like that bit in SpongeBob where Patrick's lost his wallet. Like, it has the same energy. The only proof I set are that the indoctrination of his story is working and you think you have all the right answer. So acknowledging recognised, recorded and provable history is indoctrination, but believing everything TikTok grifters tell you to believe isn't. Interesting. Also, if you're going to try and downplay someone else's intelligence, make sure you can spell and use proper grammar first. Okay, next one. This is another timestamped comment, so before I read this to you, I'm going to show you the bit of the video that he's referring to. Many of the Roman artefacts that have been excavated in the city can be found in the Canterbury Roman Museum, which is actually built down onto the original Roman street level. And one of the artefacts on display includes an original Roman floor mosaic, which has actually been warped out of shape by the passage of time and the movement of the ground. Off the back of this, he says, "Man, it's almost like someone found a town that was so destroyed that there was basically rubble left, but the spot was very good. Strange that. First of all, Canterbury's a city, not a town. I mentioned this quite clearly. Perhaps you should listen harder. Canterbury has a very consistent and well-recorded history for over 2,000 years. At no point has it been destroyed or basically rubble, and at no point in my video do I suggest that. But yeah, good job taking real-life facts and completely misrepresenting them to suit your own opinion. I'm sure you're the first Tartarian theorist who's ever done that." Next one, same video, same guy, another timestamp. I'll play it for you now. Coming back to the original point though, everything I just mentioned contradicts the idea that sediment was suddenly deposited into these cities in one go by a giant mud flood, and in fact shows that the city level and the street level was raised slowly over several centuries. And in this comment he says the problem is that you assume it has to be one simultaneous global event. Why? Oh boy. I mentioned several times in the video that you are commenting on, and I assume have watched, that it could have been multiple events. Now, there are conflicting ideas within the community about whether this was one giant mud flood or if it was a series of multiple smaller mud floods that conveniently hit every single Tartarian city. One of these is the idea that there was a series of volcanic super eruptions that left the cities of the world under the mud. Also, there is no geological evidence to support the idea that there was even one supervolcano eruption around the time of the mud flood or mud floods. It's because theorists can't seem to agree on when the mud flood or mud floods actually happened. Another theory is the idea that the mud floods were not caused intentionally. Next one, same guy again. I'm going to play the footage for the timestamp and then I'll let you know what he thinks. It also seems weird to me that theorists think destroying every Tartarian building would be impractical in some way, but a series of cataclysmic mud floods spreading across the entire world is completely practical. So in response to this, he said, then maybe those cataclysmic events were used for that very purpose. But that would also imply that someone had and could use very advanced tech, and there is no thing like 0 point energy that they could have had back then. Huh? What's this? And then he lists loads of academic sources about 0 point energy and finishes with, damn, these things are everywhere, I'm drowning in papers. Okay, first of all, I will admit it is actually quite nice to see a comment that has some form of citation in it. I believe that's the first one today that's actually had any kind of evidence involved. But to the person that wrote this comment, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to go back through those papers and then find me anything in there that suggests we had knowledge of 0 point energy in the 18th century. If you can't find any, there's probably a good reason for that. It's because they didn't know about it back then. Like, all of these articles you reference, bar one, are less than 20 years old, and 0 point energy wasn't even theorized until 1911. I could pull up a load of essays about thermonuclear reactions from 50 years ago. That doesn't prove that Genghis Khan had a hydrogen bomb. Also, I don't really know why you've adopted such a condescending tone for this comment. Like, at no point did I deny the existence of 0 point energy, and at no point did I mention 0 point energy. I mean, I think this comment is a bit of a whataboutism, to be honest. Like I already said, I don't deny the existence of 0 point energy. I didn't mention it in the video because it's not relevant, and it's not relevant because just because we have a basic understanding of it now, it doesn't mean we knew about it 300 years ago. You cannot prove that we had knowledge of 0 point energy 300 years ago, and the reason you can't prove that is because we didn't. Alright, next one. This comment is about the world fairs, which is interesting. This is going to be a big topic in episode 3, which is going to be my next video. So if you want to know more about this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stick around for that video. In this comment, he says, if you look into the world fairs, you'll realise how immensely we've been lied to. And I don't mean just read about it. Do a deep dive into the pictures, sizes of things, the population that existed in those cities, the amount of workers needed, the time frame it was said to be completed in, the amount of visitors, and then the fires and destruction. On one hand, they say it was like paper mache buildings, but in the other hand, the buildings that remained are some of our greatest, most detailed, large, expensive, and most coveted buildings we have. So why wouldn't they lie about Tartaria or Egypt or Rome or anything else? We've been lied to since in the womb. There's a lot to unpack for that comment, so I'll do it bit by bit. Yes, there were fires, and a lot of these fires were caused by the fact that these buildings are temporary and made out of wood, which is flammable. And yes, not all of the structures are temporary, but the biggest, most elaborate and most ornate buildings, such as the main halls, usually were temporary, which is why they are the buildings that aren't around anymore. The permanent ones are still there, and the temporary ones are not. Do you see how that works? Also, a lot of the permanent structures that were made for world fairs all over the globe weren't actually finished in time for their respective event. For example, the Nordic Museum in Stockholm for the 1897 exhibition was not finished in time, neither was the Albright Art Gallery for the 1901 World's Fair in Buffalo. These large coveted buildings also have very detailed construction records that align perfectly with our own historical records and also the world fairs they were purposely built for. Also, a lot of these structures were being built decades after the Tartarian Empire allegedly fell. So unless the Tartarians built these after they were all dead, I'm pretty sure they had nothing to do with it. And like I mentioned, the biggest and most ornate world fairs buildings are the ones that aren't there anymore because they were the temporary structures that were built purposely and specifically for these world fairs events. If these buildings really are relics of an old world that's been wiped from history, then why can't we find pictures of them that predate their respective world fairs? If they are new buildings constructed with Tartarian technology, then why were so many of them not finished in time? If they were new buildings constructed with Tartarian technology, then why do we have access to blueprints and construction records that entirely contradict everything the Tartarian Empire theory wants us to believe about these buildings? And again, the time frame of construction aligns really well if you consider the fact that the biggest buildings they were making were temporary. If these buildings are made out of limestone and granite, then yes, it would be impossible to make them in 2 years, or at least very hard to. But they're not made out of limestone and granite, they're made out of wood and paper mache, which is why they were built so quickly. So why do Tartarian theorists not mention these annoying little details? It's because these annoying little details prove that these buildings are not Tartarian and that the world fairs are not relics of an ancient world that do not exist anymore. World fairs still happen. Like, they're not this long forgotten, old world, erased from history type event that doesn't happen anymore. The last World's Fair finished on the 13th of October 2025. They still happen. So like, I don't understand this narrative of like, oh, the world fairs hold all the secrets to Tartaria. Because they don't. They just don't, okay? And I'm going to go into this in a lot more detail in my next full-length video. So I'm not going to spill all of the beans now because obviously I want to save it for then. But if you are interested, like I said, stick around for that video. Okay, next comment. This one is also from episode 2. They've written, how can anything debunk a world filled with gigantic rock and brick structures we can personally go and inspect with doors and windows and full levels below the ground? I, in the video you comment on, repeatedly explain why there are windows and doors below the street level all over the world. It is because of a process called street level raising that is very consistent and very widespread across all of Europe for literally thousands of years. I hate referencing the same place over and over again, but my case study on Canterbury in the video does quite clearly detail how this is possible. There was no mud flood and the streets are higher than they used to be because of general processes that will naturally happen over several centuries. God, this hat's actually not that comfortable. Not that I was ever going to wear it for the style factor, but you know. Now we've got yet another comment from the same person with yet another timestamp. So here's what they were talking about. The large amount of shale in the Eurasian plate shows that there is a high presence of sedimentary rock which could have formed from mud. However, it cannot be a source of the mud flood given the time frame offered by Tartarian theorists. This is because sedimentary rocks such as shale need thousands or potentially millions of years to form. Okay, admittedly, this doesn't disprove the mud flood, but what it does do is it shows us that shale and the presence of other sedimentary rocks in Eurasia can't be used as proof to support the presence of a mud flood. In response to this, he says, go to a hot area with fine sand and pour water on it. Then wait a bit and do it again a few times. After that, dig around the wet spot, maybe a hand wide. You will hold in your hands a wet lump of sand that can be hardened into sedimentary rock quite quickly. Edit because answers don't stick. Short, a barcode, I'm not quite sure why he's put that. And sorry, you'll have to do some work yourself, and quickly as in decades. Simply adding water to sand will not turn it into sedimentary rock. In fact, all it will do is surprisingly get it wet and saturated. Sedimentary processes like compaction and lithification take literally thousands of years to happen. If you add a handful of water to sand a few times, you will not get sedimentary rock, you will get wet sand. Mud will not turn into sedimentary rock after a few decades. You are welcome to disagree, but that would make you wrong, so I wouldn't recommend it. Alright, next one. And surely it would never happen that archaeologists dismiss stories passed down through generations by old cultures. There has never been a case where someone went somewhere, befriended the locals and got an entirely different story. But those stories are just meddlesome and full of strange mysticism, so we'll just dismiss them. These people live in a village after all, what could they know? First of all, I never actually said anything to go against this, I also never insinuated otherwise either. So why don't you try making an argument against the things I did say, rather than putting words in my mouth and losing an argument against those instead. It's also strange how you failed to give any examples to back up your claim, but I'll do you a favour, here's one. When explorers first went to Easter Island, they asked natives how the Moai got there, and the locals said that they walked. Europeans dismissed this because obviously stones can't walk, and the mystery persisted for years. But then we realised by walked they meant that they stood them upright and rocked them back and forth up the hill using ropes. The confusion came from differences in linguistic understanding, not because these stories are meddlesome and challenge our narrative. I find it kind of funny that you insinuate our history dismisses the culture of native people, while you yourself support a conspiracy that undermines and dismisses the history of literally dozens of cultures, ethnicities and civilizations from all over the world with your fake history narrative. Superfan number 1 also has another thing to say, let's see what he's droning on about this time. If the soil from cities such as Paris and St. Petersburg all came from one mud flood, then surely they would have a lot more qualities in common, but they don't. In response to this, he says, looking back on the other photos in your video, did you look up any pictures where they dug up the street? Maybe there is more below. Old photos of American cities curiously have stone houses and mud roads. Wonder how their building efforts went. Must have been hard to transport granite and marble when it rained, but you seem to be quite confident in your assessments. Yeah, there's a reason I'm confident in my assessments. It's because I researched it and I know I'm right, if only you could relate. Heavy building materials are transported along roads using specially built wagons that were pulled by fleets of horses or oxen. These wagons were called Conestoga wagons, and amazingly they could carry 5 short tons at a time. But Conestoga wagons should not be confused with prairie wagons, which are the much smaller wagons that were used for western migration. A curved bed stopped loads from shifting while they were on the move, and the large horse-drawn wheels meant that they could navigate through dense mud, much like what you would experience if it rained. However, heavy loads were transported by river or train where possible. An example of this can be found in the United States with the Granite Railway that was used to transport big heavy pieces of building material to Boston. It would have been good if you included a few examples of buildings that you think they could not have built back then using these Conestoga wagons, river connections or train lines, but you did not include any references, so I can't really go any further with this reply. I did include references in my video, which is why I am confident in my assessment. This is a long one, so strap in. I'm hearing a whole lot of uniformitarian claptrap. If the content poster can't wrap his mind around the concept of catastrophism, he has already lost it out of his depth. The dude is a Baal earther, believes in dinosaurs, uniformitarianism, and conveniently ignores liquefaction through frequency warfare as an explanation for mud flooding. Together with blind faith in scientism and his story, this debunking episode is a rather sad and lame attempt to retain narrative control amongst the burgeoning populace of awakening individuals. 2 thumbs down. I've got 2 responses to this. The first one is one I wrote in the same vein and same tone as the original comment. I'm hearing a lot of ill-informed and unproven opinions being masqueraded as facts. If the comment poster thinks the world is flat, then they have no business trying to assume the intellectual high ground, and we have nothing further to discuss until their critical thinking develops. To add to that, I actually don't ignore the possibility of liquefaction. In fact, I directly mention it during the video you commented on. Other theories go down more speculative, sci-fi based routes, with one theory suggesting that the world elite used some kind of Tartarian liquefaction device to purposely bury all of the Tartarian cities in mud. Firstly, couldn't the world elite just use these Tartarian liquefaction devices to destroy the buildings instead of causing a mud flood? Surely that would have been much easier and much more efficient. The reason I don't go into more detail on liquefaction warfare is because when it comes to evidence, there isn't really anything solid, excuse the pun, to support it. And there are no solid details because there is no evidence. There is no evidence because it didn't happen. And as for retaining narrative control, trust me, I'm the last person that's ever going to be singing the praises of the establishment. But you don't have to be a full-blown crackpot to be anti-establishment. That's something that a lot of people in this conspiracy don't seem to understand. You can hold resentment for the world elite without being a flat earther. It is possible, trust me. Now we've looked at all the things the comments did say, I want to take a little bit of time at the end to point out all the things they did not say. For example, absolutely no one has addressed the point I raised about the Babylonian astronomical diaries. If years had been added or taken away from our conventional timeline, then the Babylonian astronomical diaries would not line up with our current records, but they do. So how does that line up with the history deletion or fake history narrative that is spun? Secondly, no one can explain to me why they acknowledge Terra Australis Incognita as a collective error of European mapmakers, yet do not extend the same judgment to Tartaria. I also gave other examples of map errors in my first video, such as the mountains of Kong and the location of Gankar Punzum, to prove that until very recently, map making has been a very difficult thing for humans to get 100% accurate. So while we're able to acknowledge these things as mistakes, but we can't do the same for Tartaria, why are you so afraid to admit that old cartographers could have been wrong? They also refuse to acknowledge the fact that most cartographers who were labelling the Far East as Tartaria never actually travelled to the region, and they only labelled it as such because they were basing their work off the work from other older cartographers who also never travelled there. There are loads of other arguments in my videos that went unanswered, but I feel like I've already taken up a lot of your time and I don't want to spend 10 minutes nitpicking my own content naming all of them. Finally though, the most glaring thing I want to point out is that almost none of these comments actually showed any evidence or citations to prove a single thing that they said. If I had taken the same approach to my videos in the sense that I was making claims without backing it up with citations or evidence, then I would have been torn apart in the comment section for it, and rightfully so. Yet when you try to make a point, citing evidence seems to be optional for some reason. So my question to all of the people that commented is, why is the burden of proof only on the shoulders of people who disagree with you? When I started debunking Tartaria a few weeks ago, I knew I was going to be in for a lot of heat. But this conspiracy does need to be called out for the misrepresentation of facts and our history that is constantly spreading online. There are so many rabbit holes and avenues in this conspiracy that need to be exposed for how misleading they are, and I look forward to doing exactly that in the rest of my Debunking Tartaria series. But despite how it may seem to people watching this video, I don't actually have any ill intent towards the people who have been conned into believing this conspiracy. Like, it's not your fault you've been lied to, but the people who lied to you, they're the people I have a problem with. So to people like My Thoughts and Everything, Gubba Homestead, James W. Lee, Question Everything, Cultivate Elevate, and all the others, you are responsible for misleading so many people, and I am going to hold you accountable for it.